I just thought to help us to reflect on today the question of the renewal that came as a result of the teaching and the grace given through the first conciliar document, and we ask the Spirit to help us to understand what the Council Fathers were trying to pass on to us, we understand correctly and apply properly this new treasure given to the Church in continuity with our ancient past. Now, in that context, I will take as a point of departure the words of our Lord to the Samaritan woman.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that there was a certain insistence on places. Well, the Lord, insofar as He is the fullness, is inviting us to place cult, worship, and therefore liturgy in a wider perspective. It is a question of the authenticity, what he calls truth, and of the heart, the spirit. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. To understand what the Holy Spirit was saying to the churches in the first conciliar document, we need always to have that in mind, that the worship of the Church, if it is not authentic, is to some extent illusory. Now, we need to be careful about two extremely dangerous and insidious, presumptuous errors. One is to think that we know more than those who have preceded us, and that has been still around in our time, as though we were the first in 2,000 years to get it right. And one finds that reaction there amongst people who have done all kinds of courses and specialities, who have a block, a mental block, a refusal of anything preceding the renewal of Vatican II, in specifically this area of liturgy. Now, the whole thrust of the present Holy Father is what now we refer to as the hermeneutic of continuity, and not that of disruption and breakage, as though there was a different thing before and after. It's one. And to understand correctly at the present, we need therefore to know very well all the dynamics of the past. And only then will we understand what the Spirit was saying to the churches. The other is what has happened in recent times, that of refusing, because of the bad application of the renewal, all that was renewal. That is also widespread, especially in certain areas and certain contexts. In France, where I was formed, there is a very strong reaction against all renewal, and you know the consequences. Now, therefore, that too has to be examined for what it is. One has to respect people because they are hanging on for dear life to what is precious to them. But the only thing is that, again, that is sometimes taken out of a wider context. Say what you like, the structure of the present parish, bishopric, and so on, is more Catholic than, for instance, a small chapel of people who are only accepting certain ways of doing things here and there. And the proof is that they will nevertheless find it difficult to celebrate their way of doing things on certain altars, because people are, and rightly so, a little hesitant about where they're coming from. So whatever they may see or say, the actual structure is that of the mainstream. And we must remember that, because that is where God is massively acting. Therefore, he is using the present structure of renewal. Therefore, the sacraments are there in their fullness, and that is where God is normally working on the parish level. And we must not be more blocking and limited and blinkered than the Holy Spirit. Having said that, if we are doing something like a mini retreat or mini course in this case with regard to the matter of faith, we need to exactly study in depth what we are handling and why. Now, the first document to be published in the council documents was the one that they handled first, that on the liturgy, for this reason that they thought that it would not be that complicated, because they knew, because of the groundwork already done from the liturgical movement, which had been in place for a good while, where they were going. They were foreseeing bigger problems down the line with dogmatic issues, as I pointed out before, completing the work of Vatican I. Now, if one studies carefully, and it's something that one might do in this era of faith, the first conciliar document to be published, Sacro Sacro Concilium, the one on the sacred liturgy, one is actually surprised to see how little detail is given. Why? They give broad outlines and ways of renewing, and hand on the application eventually to the Commission, which does the practical work of giving us what we now have. Therefore, we want to go earlier than the Council to see where they're coming from and what the Holy Spirit had been whispering here and there to those who were aware of the need for renewal as regards what he was wanting to do. That in order to understand correctly all that is in the document and the correct application of it afterwards. Now, as it happens, as I was growing up, caught up in this, because my parish was a Benedictine parish belonging to the largest of all English monasteries, Ampleforth, and it was being run by people of a certain calibre who were in that period both before, during and after of liturgical renewal, and they knew exactly what was afoot and why. In fact, Don Lawrence Beverner, who was my spiritual father and himself one of the main applicants of it on the liturgical level, insofar as, like Gelino in France, the Jesuit, Père Joseph Gelino, he worked in English on what Gelino was working on in France, making psalms and other things workable, that is, liturgically, giving melodies which by now are everywhere in the liturgical world of the monastic English-speaking countries. L.B. Lawrence Beverner is everywhere, and very good liturgical music, as Gelino is everywhere in France. Now, these people were, remember, already at work for a good while before Vatican II, because experts like these would be keen on meeting other experts, and the liturgical movement was very strong in the monastic world, especially in certain countries, Germany and France, for instance, and they were already doing things in private circles which eventually would be made official in the post-conciliar years, but there were things going on at Mont César and other great monasteries, and great ones in Germany as well, where things were done in crypts and so on, applying theoretically and even in practice what they thought were the correct ways of interpreting and how things would go ahead. It was being thought out, as I say, by people of grand quality and value, but always in reference to where they were coming from. Now, there were certain intuitions coming through on a general scale in this liturgical movement. One was the question of the language itself. Now, the language, obviously in the Latin Rite, we are in the Latin Rite, that is under the Patriarch of the West, Rome, has to be officially still Latin. That's the way that things are done in a document still, which hangs on to essential formulae which have to be very precise. They are published in Latin. And the prayer of the Church also had been, nevertheless, say what one says, even in the Celtic Church was actually, to a large extent, Latin. And we have still the documents in Mene, the Latin patrology. We can actually study the ancient Celtic liturgy. A lot of psalms, very, very long offices, but Latin actually was the language. And the various ways of doing things within the English-speaking world, but in Latin there were different traditions. We had in Britain the Sarum Rite, which was very important. Sarum is the Latin for Salisbury, and that became the basis for the Book of Common Prayer at the period of the Protestant Reformation. They took the Sarum Rite, but expunged it of everything which was vaguely Catholic and made of it something which was able to hold both the doctrine of transubstantiation and that of anything else. In other words, it was a vaguely Eucharistic document which says anything that one wanted to say. It's a brilliant work actually of ambiguity, but that's how they did it. But they took what was there, Sarum. Now, if you look carefully at these old rites, there are certain things which are everywhere the same in the Latin rite. One is the canon, and the very word means rule or norm, canon in Greek. The canon, the Roman canon, is the first Eucharistic prayer now. And remember, the Council Fathers did not foresee that there would be a change of the canon. It would always be the Roman canon. They had presumed that. And even in the liturgical movement, there was not any talk really about changing the canon. It was so ancient, it's actually of apostolic origin. And the proof is there in some of the expressions. Hunc praeclarum calicem. The priest says, takes this praeclarum calicem, this supereminent chalice, this most special chalice. They are referring to the actual chalice used by the Lord at the Lord's Supper, which they still had in the apostolic band and times. They were still using it, and therefore it's of apostolic origin, this prayer. And the gestures are those of the early Semitic way of doing things, raising his eyes to heaven and so on. And also the words and gestures of the Lord are reproduced, and actually in the gestuality, benedicted and so on, it's all there, going right back to ancient times. And also the Semitic references to points of interest only really to Jews are there, and they've carried through. You've got reference to Abel. You've got his sacrifice there. Why would a non-Jew want to hang on to something like that? Therefore it's of Jewish origin. You've got Abraham in there, our father in faith. Our father in faith. It's therefore apostolic. You've got Melchizedek in there, that strange figure. You've got the angel in there carrying the sacrifice to the altar on high, St. Michael. But these things are, although it's probable that the original form of the present Roman canon was slightly shorter, because it would seem that they balanced out one memento. There's one memento for the living, one for the dead. The one of them comes after the other in time. It would seem to balance out. But this question also of having the early saints is also an indication of its antiquity. Why keep all these ancient saints, these two lists? You've got one before and one after. These are indications that they were so close to the origin, and they were so very much involved with the early celebrations in the catacombs, that they were aware of these heroes around them. And they're still there to this day, obscure saints, but they're there. Therefore showing how ancient and unchangeable this was. Now, there were problems, however, in this. Now, if you look carefully at the Roman canon, in the way it was executed until 1969, 1970, it was still the words that we have now, but with the obligation of having all the saints in them, and also the expressions per Christum Dominum Nostrum after every paragraph. The obligation is there. But apart from that, the wording is not changed. You have what is very difficult, and it was already intuited at the Council of Trent, the question of the number of signs of the cross. Now, you see, there are problems there, even theologically. You've got signs of the cross appearing over the elements even after the consecration. Quite a lot. What's going on there? You can't bless something already consecrated. It has no sense. So what's happening? They're, as it were, in Latin, sigillando, they set a seal upon something. A sigillum is a seal. They're sealing, and they're pointing out, they're indicating. And these, however, it was already seen as a problem when things were being put in place in the Missal of 1570, the Missal that was in use until 1969, that of the Council of Trent, which is after the Council of Trent, of course, but it was fixed there. But it was discussed, but they know we were keeping those signs of the cross. It was so venerable. It was only Vatican II that had the courage actually to eliminate all signs of the cross, except the one at the beginning, at the blessing, once, not a number of times. And then that's not repeated even at the epiclesis. Where epiclesis, when the priest puts his hand, you see, it's not repeated again there. It's just, there's a logical consequence there. And never after the consecration. There was also the question of the number of genuflections, even in the course of the Eucharistic prayer itself, the canon, a large number. They were all simplified, because now it's actually quite curious what happened to explain why these things had come to such a number of crosses, and a large number of them, and genuflections. I'll try and explain roughly what happened. the Council of Trent did not add or invent. It took what was there. Where were they coming from? Well, they were coming from the different liturgical families. Now, a liturgical family is something of great antiquity and often of apostolic origin. So they did not have the courage to take away bits so old. So what did they do? They kept them, but in parallel and juxtaposition. The result is a very heavy canon and a very heavy liturgy. Because everything that you found in that group, you'll keep that one and you'll keep that one. So you've got, for instance, just before the consecration, again, you take the bread, Akshepit panem, he took bread, benedixit, you've got a blessing again coming in there, and the same with the chalice, coming from one of the liturgical families, and so on, right through the Eucharistic prayer. Everything they found they kept, so that a very large number by the end was there, and was there until the Vatican Council actually attacked it, at least in the common the commission that interpreted afterwards. Now, also, add to that the fact that you have, right through liturgy, the same phenomenon taking place. What you find, if you look carefully now at the liturgy as it was until 1969, well, actually it wasn't quite so simple, because there was different steps already. Blessed John the 23rd simplified things somewhat, and then there were steps even afterwards. The 1965 version was a halfway house. It was essentially the Tridentine Mass, but somewhat simplified. And you would have known that for a few years. There was a period of interim when that was being used, when readings were in English, the canon was in Latin, but the prayers, the collect and so on were actually in English. But it's basically the Tridentine in English, but there was a simplification of certain things, e.g. this, which was a problem, and they were aware of the problem. If you look carefully at different parts of the liturgy, until Vatican II, what was taking place was this. Analyze the way that the priest starts off in the old rite. Now, he comes in, and what had been originally prayers of preparation, way before he actually came onto the altar, had crept in already as things to be said at the altar, Alfera Nobis, all these things, they're kind of things which basically were crystallized there and they could not be moved, they were so ancient. But you've got the result. You've got not one, but about 3 beginnings. Now, look what's going on there. He comes up, he starts already the prayers at the foot of the altar in profound bowing and so on, but then you start off, okay, that's one start there, the sign of the cross is there, and then you go in straight away, the psalm, intro Ibro, I will go unto the altar of my God, it's Psalm 42, isn't it? It's a part of that one, intro Ibro al Tare Dei, and then he's responding that with the altar boys, or eventually the congregation. And then, okay, that's one beginning, intro Ibro. Then you've got this other beginning. He makes again the sign of the cross. Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini. That's the beginning of another liturgical family. And in the Carthusian Rite, which I had known in France, they had their own. It was another one again. Pone Domini custodiam ori meo. Place, Lord, a guard over my mouth. And so on. Each family had its own thing. And the old ones were able to be kept even after Vatican II. So anyway, this one again, Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini, is another one again, and off he goes again with new prayers. He starts off now with the Confiteor, which is again a problem because it was doubled up. Before he could absolve, he had to be absolved. So he starts off, you see, a very long Confiteor, and then in this profound bow, and then he's absolved by the people in the person of the altar boys, and then he gets up, and then they start off, you see, and they do theirs, and doubling up again, you see. Now, there's a problem again, he doesn't finish there. What happened then was, you remember that there was a tendency to receive Holy Communion outside Mass. That was often how it was done, because people would go to Communion even at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then even it was a strange kettle of fish, but often it was, because Communion had to be done fasting and so on. But there was a lot of that going on. So the instinct of having the Confiteor before Communion and the absolution before Communion, and a kind of absolution like that, it was pretty strong, you see. So that was there. Even having said those 2 Confiteors at the beginning, it was still there before Holy Communion again. Just before Communion, you had another Confiteor coming in there. Now, you see, 3 times. Yes. Now, you see the pattern is emerging, it becomes very heavy. Yeah. Now, then, okay, it doesn't finish there. He's absorbed, and then he starts off again with another sign of the cross. No sign of the cross. But he starts telling himself again, Deus tu conversus vivificabis nos, Lord God, you will convert and bring us to life. And then more prayers going on there, you see, all dialogue. And then he starts to go up. Yes. He's starting to start. Now, so he starts, then kisses the altar and so on, and then he starts again. You see, there's another sign of the cross at the right there. He goes to the missal and starts again, you see. It says the introit, you see. It's about 4 starts you've got already, you see. Then he starts, and then you've got this other problem coming in. You've got this, in the low mass it works all right, because you're just answering one person. You're not the altar boy and so on. And you Kyrie alternating with him and so on, the Gloria alternating, and on you go. But you bring that into a missa cantata, the high mass, the sung mass, you have a problem. The priest had the obligation to say all the words. Now what happens there, you're doubling up. You've got 2 celebrations going on practically, if you look carefully what's going on there. The priest is doing his thing at the altar, and then you've got someone else, and if you've got a sub-deacon, he might be chanting the epistle away, you see. In the gospel, somebody other deacon might be doing that, you see. And you've got, whatever the choir is singing, he's got to do as well, you see. He's got to say it as well. So you've got these 2 things going on at the same time. Now do you see the problem? Yes. The real need for renewal, and what the whole liturgical thrust was about, liturgical movement, it was real renewal. It was needed a simplification to get back to what was referred to later as the grand lines, to see the architecture of liturgy, the thrust of it, you see. Yes. This heaviness was actually damaging. Now, to understand correctly what the council was trying to do, you've got to get that in perspective, otherwise no one will understand properly the whole problem to be attacked. It wasn't a question of exploding at all, but of getting toward an authenticity. Yes. Now, on we go, and so on. It goes right through. You can. I just took some examples there, giving an example of what had to be handled, but it's the same pattern right throughout. Now, therefore, there was another problem as well, and it was a serious problem, and actually it's still there. It was this. You look carefully at the number of words the priest had to say, and didn't just, because even in the sacristy he was always starting, you see, and I still use actually the prayers of vesting and so on, but there were other prayers that he was invited to say as well, but there were prayers at the end which was more or less obliged to say, long ones, a whole psalm, those children, the 3 in the furnace said, that long one was memorized, you see, and that had to be said from memory at the end, and therefore there was a lot of prayers going on even before and after. Now, therefore, you had, remember, half an hour for your celebration, because when I was in Fatima last week, it was the same thing there. We had those who tried doing the old mass in private. We had the altar farmed out between us. Each one had to be half an hour, no more. And so therefore, what you do, you have to go at a fairly nifty pace. You have to. Yes. So and that was the way it was done. In monasteries, you have 50 priests and so on. It was the same there. There was different. You have 2 usually, but you had 2 moments in which you celebrate it. One after the other. It has to be done between the offices. Therefore, you've got the obligation to not be more than half an hour. There's no place waiting for you to come on the altar, your little altar. And that's how it was done. Therefore, the instinct was there. It was okay. You can do it in half an hour, but it does mean that you've got this law, nevertheless, of more or less this kind of speed. And that's the way it's done, you see. You can't waste a moment. And you can't pause and take it in as the respiration which is invited in the whole liturgy, not just actually the liturgy of the Mass itself, but the whole liturgy, since Vatican II, the invitation is to make it aerated, to have pauses. Now, the whole thrust, therefore, is profoundly different. It's no longer a question of, if you like, quantity. Yes. But the question is it going necessarily to be quality? One would hope, you see, that would have been the result. There would have been, therefore, a slowing down. And also taking on board of the invitations to have silences and to say things with meaning, that authenticity of which the Lord himself speaks when he says, worship in spirit and in truth. Yes. In practice, did that happen? Question mark. Yes. Well, it did in some countries, but not in everyone. It did certainly in the countries which had been pushing for liturgical renewal, because it was much more discussed in some countries like Germany and France than in others like Ireland, where it was more of a devotional kind of situation. The rosary was very important in Ireland, that kind of thing. See, the liturgical questions were not so much the centre of attention now, but they were very much so in France and Germany, the countries which were very much on avant-garde with regard to the liturgical movement. Now, therefore, the result, unfortunately, in Ireland was that we did not get the full benefit. Because what actually happened was this, if you look carefully, they turned the altars round, or brought them forward, and they went into English, but we had more of the same thing, speed. It was still there, even afterwards, and it's still there even now, quite often. Many priests go at the same speed as they would have gone before, even in English, even when it's much shorter. So that's not the benefit of renewal. It's not understanding what the renewal is meant to be at all. Because the whole mentality was that the Council Fathers were wanting that there should be a huge self-understanding of the church in regard to what prayer was about. In reducing the quantity and making it that every gesture was once done well, slowly and meaningfully, and every word was said once only, meaningfully, and with, yes, exactly, understandably and with thought, that the natural consequence would have been to have had liturgy which was dynamic in its every part. Now, that's not to in any way jettison what we're coming from, but it's to understand if we don't get the benefit of it, we're worse off than had we not changed it. Because at least the old had the advantage of sustaining the sacred. There was an aura and something about it which was so different that everyone understood, even understanding the words that were before something greater than ourselves. Now, the danger is that we've become very, very human. You add to that a lack of interiority in, for instance, a celebrant, what will you get? Something so human that he's the centre of attention, a new form of clericalism dominating the people in his person. Now that's very dangerous, and it's there, big time, unfortunately. A show, a theatrical performance, so horizontal that the Lord, one wonders where he is in all that. And when it comes to things like applause and cracking jokes, where are we at? You see, now that was not at all correct renewal. That's just plain misunderstanding and lack of maturity and incapacity, let's say it. Because the opportunity was there to make something hugely dynamic and powerful and meaningful, presuming that we were grown up and adults to handle it responsibly and to use well the new possibilities that were there. Alas, how many understood that? Now, the other sector would be that of the liturgy of the hours. And it was understood that henceforth it was to be more also the prayer of the church, not just the clerics. Hence, yourselves, who would before have been using a little office of Our Lady or something, wouldn't you? And Francois de Sales had that in it, he would, because it was very heavy, wasn't it? The breviary, until the Vatican Council. So you, the Carmelites had the liturgical office of the church, but you, I understand, had another one, didn't you? Shorter.
We had interim in between.
Yes, you of course, it depends on where you came in, sister, but before going back to St. Francois de Sales, they did not, I think, have the obligation of the full office of the church, did they, your order?
No, we had the office of Our Lady.
That's it, you had the office of Our Lady.
Yes.
So you see, that is because it was so heavy. And many female congregations in the same situation. It was not therefore the full benefit of it was not exactly the voice of the church in the same way.
No.
So that was something positive, that they were opening the doors for all these liturgical parts of the church to have the liturgy of the church. Therefore all monks and nuns of any description would have the same office, more or less. Now the difference would be that those who took on board, for instance, any in the contemplative life who would wish the Roman office, they were invited by the Vatican, after when they were implying all this, for them to take on, of course, not just the minimum, that is, they would have all 3 day offices, terce, sext and none.
Oh, yes.
But also, for those in the contemplative life, the invitation was there given by the Vatican to have not just a monthly cycle for matins, for the office of readings, vigils, but those who are obliged to the choir, but to have actually a fortnightly one. That is, that one took the, for instance, work week 1 and week 3, and week 2 and week 4. You see, that's, and then one reads the first reading, the scriptural reading, after the first nocturne, the first 3 psalms, say week 1, and then one would go back into the psalms of the fortnight later, and then in the monastic style one would have the second reading, that from the patristic text in the second nocturne, and then it was also then, it's in there for the vigils of feasts and solemnities. There you've got there, it's in the back of the breviary, the canticles and gospels there, which give you a third nocturne, with the Te Deum, and also if there's a prior or a celebrant there, priest present, an abbot, or whatever, after the reading from the gospel, which on the Sunday would be that of the resurrection, one of the ones of resurrection. In the monastery where I was formed, we had the Paschal candle for that, lit and so on. But then there would be the opportunity for a homily, a sermon.
Yes.
And I've seen it done. I do it myself if I have a guest for vigils, homily after the Gospel of the Sunday or of the feast day. If you're using the Roman breviary there for the liturgy of the hours. Now, what am I saying there? Now, this was also something which was destined to have, it has had that effect, one must say that, but it's not everywhere to the same extent, of making liturgy something equally more authentic insofar as it gives you the opportunity to taste the psalms and to pause, because the invitation to have a pause after the psalms is there. If one doesn't have that pause after the psalms, one is still in that mentality of getting through it. Because the whole reason for reducing the quantity is for two things: make us be able to perceive the power of the words, because too many words leave you dumb, leave you dulled.
Yeah.
You can't really take them in, they're bombarding you too much. And also, and I heard an abbot saying that in France there, because he was getting the whole thing to be sung if possible, the whole office, including the vigils. Yeah. The question of singing the psalms and the office.
Yes.
You see, if one goes then from one said to said, that is between what was there before and what is after, you carry on in mode of recitation, you have not got the full benefit, because the whole thrust was less words, fewer words, but more beauty. Because you can sing very easily any psalm, especially in the Grail translation which we have in English. They had in France a good translation for a while, which was there for a good while, but they were, as we had the metrical ones, they've changed them now a bit in France, but we had in the council, in the application of the council, we were blessed in the English-speaking world, all of the English-speaking world actually, to have at that time published, it was published in the 60s, the Grail Psalms. Now they were made from the beginning to be sung. And they're very helpful, because they sometimes are a bit elastic on the actual translation, but they do work on the level of singing, because they're made to be sung. Far better than, for instance, what we have in Italy. It's very difficult to use 4-line melodies and 6-line melodies for the psalms we have in Italian, because they're based on the 2-line division, basically, not the 4-line one, and they have a lot of exceptions coming in. You have the flexus, you have one extra line coming in, you see, and it makes it very awkward. So the advantage is that whereas if you've got a 2-line psalm, a 2-line melody, it's very boring.
Yes.
If you've got a 4-line and 6-line one, it's much more interesting. Add to that, they've done it in quite a few places, I've seen it in France, add to that polyphony, it becomes very singing, even polyphony, at least the doxology. And I've seen a system, for instance, in France, where you'd have one line starting off, you'd have another part of the choir which would add a second line, or the first line kept going as a harmony then a third line coming in, and a fourth line coming in, so that by the end of every verse you had four voice polyphony. So things like that. Now, the whole thing is this: there was a huge explosion of potentiality in the whole liturgical movement, and it was perceived as such and profited from as such in some places, especially monasteries which were into liturgical renewal in a positive way. They knew what they wanted and they got it. Now when it came to eventually the decree on the council, even those who were quite conservative, like Octaviani, well, they were aware of the importance of authentic renewal, and the initial reaction of Octaviani himself, when they just got things through the voting, was, we have got the majority of the things the liturgical movement were striving for. That was a positive remark he was making, but he was one of the first to realise very quickly how things were being hijacked and jeopardised. And then there was a very strong reaction, and Ratzinger himself actually was amongst those who in the early stages was very much in favour of correct application and renewal and so on. They knew exactly what they wanted, but Ratzinger was one of the first to realise what was being threatened with people immature, taking things on board and not doing things exactly in the same line as the Council Fathers. Now, therefore, you've got this other element then of the fullness of the prayer of the Church, which has to be there, because the Mass is the centre, but it's like the sun with its rays coming out. The liturgical life is complete only when the divine office is done in that same mode of renewal and authenticity. And it's actually interesting to see, especially in monastic settings, how that has been taken on board. Because a lot of the elements of the Eastern style sometimes have come in with good use. Incense, the use of gestuality, the body, lights, and movement, bodily movement. It's not just a cerebral, a head issue. The liturgy involves the whole of the person. It's the work of the people of God. The laos is the people of God, and its ergos is the actual liturgy, par excellence, liturgy, liturgia. And so there we are. Now, where am I coming to? Where does that leave us? Well, there's another element again, and it was put this way. I remember when in a book I was studying there in France in formation, it was referring to these moments of renewal, because we were studying, remember, in the authors which were earlier than ourselves, and therefore they were handling renewal as it was coming along. And one powerful remark in this book was this: no matter how much work one does on the restructuring of liturgy, if there is no intimacy in the soul, it is all external. Now that's the issue. One cannot have liturgy, and this is my third point, without that element there. It doesn't work ex opere operato, often the work accomplished, except for the Mass itself, which does. But the liturgy has an element of ex opere operantis, from the work of the person working. That is to say, its value, as well as being the voice of Christ and of the Church, of course, it has its objective value and has that objective giving of God to God of his rights as creator over our time, our voices, our beauty. Yes, but this worship in spirit and in truth, of which our Lord himself speaks, comes into play properly only when actually there is a correspondence. That is, when there's an expression of something there. One can't throw dust and sand in the eyes of the Creator and think we've done our duty. We can't be doing wonderful things and not actually obeying him and honouring him. I remember hearing Father John, my parish priest, was saying to me one time, it was regarding to one monastery in Ireland, which did things very well liturgically, and somebody had been there for Vespers one Sunday. Oh, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And he congratulated the celebrant at the end, you see. And he dismissed it with, well, it's only theatre anyway. Only theatre anyway. Well, look, that's, if it's coming to that, I mean, he was saying he was tongue-in-cheek, but is it nevertheless somehow perhaps indicative it can actually come to that? It's only theatre anyway. And a lot of our liturgy, sometimes there's a lot of theatre going on, even on parish level, when we're actually playing to the gallery and expecting applause. Now, you see, it's the same thing, but it actually happens also if, for instance, it becomes so perfect that one is thinking about the perfection. We call it ritualism. That is the illness of actually looking at the rite and the external, and actually not in intimacy. And liturgy can be so demanding sometimes that one gets into that mode, one has to get it bang on, and one loses sight of the intimacy with the Lord. And the proof is that when we don't get it right, we're corrected without charity by somebody who might be looking after the ceremony. Well, you see, that's displeasing to the one that we're trying to adore. It is self-defeating. But without having to go that far, even on the level of, for instance, if one is so concerned about, for instance, musical perfection, that one is sometimes afraid even of doing things which perhaps would be pleasing to the Lord even in their imperfection, it's rather sad. And then the consequence is that one opts to say everything rather than sing it. Well, again, it's a cop-out, isn't it?
Yes.
It's not necessarily either or, but it can be certainly both and. And the advantage of the post-conciliar liturgy is this, that actually in the correct understanding of the renewal, there is an invitation now, not a prohibition, but an invitation to have at every celebration of the Eucharist, for instance, some singing. It was not allowed before. It had to be either or. There were allowed in the low Mass a certain amount of, for instance, hymns, even actually in English at certain points. But there was this notion in the air that either it was sung or said, you see. You couldn't have a halfway house. But now this element of a certain elasticity has made it possible to have celebrations even on a weekday and so on, which are very interesting, using, for instance, simple things without books, Taizé chants. And you create an atmosphere very well and very simply, closing your eyes. It's very powerful and correct renewal. And also with regard to liturgy, I remember when I was a student in Dublin, I was living with missionaries, and they did have that. We didn't have the full liturgical office celebrated with song, but they had, in everything we had together in chapel, bits of singing. Therefore it wasn't either or, it was both and it worked very well, and that can be done. So there's no need to have all said. Now, having said that, the more one actually dares to go into, for instance, looking around at what's going on well elsewhere and taking in certain expert advice, it doesn't do any harm at all, because unfortunately we tend to get into a rut, don't we? But we're missing an experience, because liturgy is something that consoles. It's a moving experience when it's well done, and the Psalms are very powerful when they're prayed interiorly. There's a whole treasure there. It's so different, you see, from what the notion in the air was until the renewal. And because I was formed member with the Carthusians there, it was unchanged. There was hardly any change at all in the Carthusian liturgy. And therefore I knew what this problem was. It was still there. We had very, very heavy offices, you see. It wasn't just the canonical office, which was very complete anyway. You're talking about 18 psalms in the night, you see. And that's only the liturgical office itself, without the office that you start. Because you started with the office of Our Lady in cell, which is complete as well. And you ended back with the office of Our Lady again, you see. Matins before and Lords after. And all the offices were doubled up. And then also you had the office of the dead every so often. So you've got 3 offices. Now you see, and you've got, anyway, there's no need to go into the details, but the point was this, you see, the mentality there, if you're brought up in that, is it's more or less getting through it. That, if you're not careful, that's the mentality. It's the onus, and the word officium actually means duty, though the office was a duty. And I remember actually the prior, because the prior, he was involved in canonical visitation, he had to go to other charter houses to visit them, you see, he was a senior member of the order, and he came out with this day, I didn't mean it in any malicious way or anything, but he was explaining to me one day the problem when you don't, if it's a visit, or he's talking specifically if you're in the general chapter, the Grand Chartreuse, we're all together, the sessions are very long and very heavy, and you've got all these 3 offices, you see, to catch up on. And he used the expression, l'office, c'est la bête noire. Du Chartres, the office is the black beast of the Carthusian. He was all the time a rush against the against the clock. Yes. The mentality was that, you see, to understand what renewal is about, you've got to know where we're coming from. Because if you haven't experienced it, you wouldn't know the problem. But that was the real need for renewal. Diminishing the quantity to get the quality and the buzzing interiority. Yes. Because that is there for the taking, but has it been taken? Yes. So I conclude this lecture, my friends, to understand where we're coming from. Unfortunately, other things have added on to the problem, specifically coming from this 3rd question that I raised, intimacy. Because now it's the ex-president of the Congregation for Divine Worship, I think, who came out with this, the ex-prefect, and he wanted people to be aware of it. It was this: one cannot talk of worship if there is not a state of grace. And he's pointing out to this fact that if a soul is therefore in disobedience with its Creator, there's incoherence there, and is not in a situation to offer him then worship, because the first worship is that of the will and the heart and of obedience. Therefore one cannot be pleasing in one's worship to Almighty God, no matter how beautiful it is, if there's not this intimacy there, because it's an expression of something which has to be there. If that thing is not there, we're working on the wrong area. Start there. Now that last thing is the problem in our time. All the abuses, all the bad applications of the bomb of Vatican II essentially stem from this. If you haven't got an inner relationship, an intimacy and dialogue which allows the Lord to be Lord of all, and of therefore your instincts and reactions, well, it's bound to lead to abuse, because we're in charge. So handle that problem, and the rest will follow. So we thank the Lord for this quiet meditation together, and ask for the grace to understand carefully and properly what the Spirit is saying to the churches, but always to be authentic in our prayer, so that every word we say and every gesture we perform is an expression of worship in spirit and in truth. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.